Ceasefire negotiations are at an advanced stage. Jeremy Scahill, my colleague at Dropside News, joins us now to talk about his reporting on what we know about where we stand. Jeremy, thanks so much for being here today. Good to be with you guys. Jeremy began. So, let's walk through where we are now. Several days ago, Donald Trump announced that he had gotten Israeli agreement on some version of a ceasefire. There was a conspicuous silence for a while from the Israelis. But then a media campaign started rolling out about what was in this agreement. My understanding, though, is that only recently did Hamas even receive a proposal. So what is the current situation? I mean, Trump is riding really high on what he perceives to be an ultra-successful military campaign against Iran. Jeremy explained. And, you know, he's had his own series of kerfuffles in Washington over how much damage was done to Iran's nuclear program. But clearly he feels empowered now to try to keep the ball rolling with his own agenda in the Middle East. What we've seen happen throughout the Trump administration is, on the one hand, Trump messages that he wants all these wars to be brought to an end. On the other hand, he's really fully empowered Netanyahu to continue and intensify the war and actually to expand it. Not just in Lebanon with repeated violations of the ceasefire, but also these 12 days of intense Israeli bombing of Iran that then, at the end, became a joint U.S.-Israeli bombing operation. But, you know, setting aside any analysis we could do about what really was at play there, Trump really, I think, sees that he has momentum. And so what happened is that earlier this week, Ron Dermer, who is Netanyahu's point person and really kind of like his Roger Stone of sorts, you know, his political hitman, arrived in Washington, D.C. for talks with a series of Trump administration officials. And what I'm told by sources is they basically concocted what they felt would be the final ultimatum that would be delivered to Hamas by regional mediators from Egypt and Qatar, saying, "This is your last chance to make a ceasefire deal. You saw the kind of power that we unleashed in Iran. Now is your time to do it." There's been a lot of reporting over the past couple of days in the Hebrew language press, the Arabic language press, as well as in the American press about what the terms of this proposal being put in front of Hamas are. I'm told, though, by sources on the negotiating team that despite this flurry of media reports about what the terms are, Hamas was not actually given any document until late last night. In fact, they haven't really been able to do full consultations within Hamas or the other resistance factions. I've spoken this morning to a source who's close to the negotiators that actually has that document in hand. And in general, what I would say is this: it is almost identical in most ways to the previous ultimatum that Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy, delivered back in May. It does not contain any clear guarantees that Israel will not resume the military assault on Gaza after an initial 60-day period. It has very vague language about how humanitarian aid is going to come into Gaza. It doesn't say anything about the fate of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, this aid scam where Palestinians are being gunned down every day. It does mention that the United Nations and the Red Crescent are again going to be involved with the distribution of aid. But there aren't any clear definitions. Perhaps the two most significant changes or amendments, I guess, that you could say in some way inch the position more toward what Hamas wanted, is that they've sharpened some of the language about President Donald Trump. There's 13 points in this agreement. In point 1 and point 13, Trump is mentioned by name. And what they're saying is that Trump is committed to an actual end to the war. And as long as negotiations are conducted in good faith, That he wants to see this 2-month window of a temporary truce continue on toward a resolution of the war. Hamas, though, had wanted much clearer language. And they wanted Trump to guarantee that he would prevent Israel from resuming its military assault on Gaza as long as the negotiations were continuing. That language is not in this document. On a technical level, the most significant change is that the Israelis back in May wanted to have 10 living captives. Israelis held in Gaza, released within the first week of any 60-day ceasefire deal. Hamas looked at that and said, then it's just going to be a 1-week deal because after the Israelis are freed, Netanyahu is just going to resume the genocide. So, it's not a huge change. But what we're looking at now is a formula that says 8 Israelis would be released within that first week. I believe it's on day 5. And then the other 2 living Israelis would be released on day 50. You would also have the bodies of 18 Israelis who are deceased but still in captivity in Gaza staggered out over the course of those 2 months. What is not mentioned in the document is how many of the more than 10,000 Palestinians held in detention camps and prisons in Israel are going to be released. That's unusual. In other agreements, there has been some formula cited for how many Palestinian captives are going to be released. The language on this is very vague. While there is not. Again, Ryan, you and I have talked about this on this show before. Hamas has offered to relinquish governing authority of Gaza. They put it in writing. It was in their draft that we talked about on this show a couple of months ago. It is not in the actual text of this agreement. And, you know, Israel and the United States, for whatever reasons, have taken that term out every time Hamas has put it forward. But I was told last night by a senior Hamas official that the mediators have made clear to Hamas that that is a condition that Israel and the United States are going to insist on. What is unclear is who takes power if Hamas does relinquish its authority. It's not just a resistance movement. It's a government. So, a lot of questions up in the air. And the final thing I'll say on this is that while I think Hamas is very seriously considering taking this deal, even though they don't think it's a good deal, they're under a lot of pressure. These guys, the negotiators, all have family members that have been killed. People are suffering immensely in Gaza. And there is unprecedented pressure against Hamas right now, not in a hostile way, but in a desperate way. Pleading, please make a deal. So, I'm told that they're giving very serious consideration to it. The question is if they're going to be able to get some amendments to this language. Last time this happened, Hamas came through and put a whole new proposal on the table. I'm told that they're looking now at a more surgical approach where they're going to zero in on what they've defined as their red lines. They really don't want Israel to be able to resume the genocide. And they want a full Israeli withdrawal. What is not in this document is anything about the Philadelphia corridor, which is a very crucial part of Gaza because it represents it's in the south of Gaza the only gateway to a world beyond Israeli control for Palestinians. It's on the Egyptian border. We reported some days ago, Ryan, that mediators last week told Hamas that they may have to be willing to concede the timeline for an Israeli withdrawal from the Philadelphia corridor. So, I think what we're seeing here, just to sum it up, is it's basically the same ultimatum that was put on the table with a few amendments that seem aimed at trying to give Hamas something. Hamas is very clear-eyed about it. A senior official told me last night that Trump is a crucial part of what he called Israel's deception operation. Even though they say that this is a deception, they're wide-eyed about it. They understand what the stakes are. And so I think we're going to see some really intense attempts at negotiation. I get the sense that Hamas very much wants to make a deal. Well, And it was announced just a couple of days ago that Netanyahu will be at the White House on Monday. Jeremy. Which seems to signal confidence from the Trump administration that something's coming. What does the timeline look like? And what did you make of that announcement? Yeah. I mean, you know, as often happens with Netanyahu, he sort of projects one message in English and another message in Hebrew. Jeremy responded. Netanyahu has been totally unhinged. Belligerent in his Hebrew language remarks over the past 24 to 48 hours where he's saying, "We're not going to stop the war until Hamas is totally eradicated. We're going to kill everyone with a gun. We're not going to have Hamas 10 anymore." On the other hand, you know, what we're hearing is that Trump really wants to kind of put on a show with this. I think he wants to make a big announcement when Netanyahu is in town. Also, we can report based on Israeli media accounts from well-connected journalists that there is talk again of another side letter. A secret side deal that Trump apparently has told the Israelis he will give them, saying that they can resume the war in Gaza if Hamas does not leave power and disarm. So, you know, it's sort of Groundhog Day again. I think that with Netanyahu coming to Washington, Trump wants to put on a big show. He wants to make a big announcement. He wants to sort of portray himself, you know, in a way that's going to go down in archival reels that are going to be shown for decades to come. He may get that moment. The real question is Trump serious about ending this war? Because if he is, he can put Netanyahu in a corner. The Israelis don't seem to think Trump is going to do that. I think Netanyahu feels like this is sort of his own victory tour of sorts. So, we'll see what happens. So, to your point about Hamas being under significant pressure, the host added, our colleague Abu Bakr Ahmed had posted yesterday. And we can put this up maybe in post. He said, growing and pressuring calls among Gazans to accept the Qatari proposal for a ceasefire. That people are desperate beyond words for a rest. 60 days can offer a huge source of relief and respite from the ongoing Holocaust. It's better than nothing. I hope it will happen. I think it was a good representation of the desperation at play here. Despite the fact that Abu Bakr and everybody else understands that it could be just 50 or 60 days and then he resumes it again. Like, how confident? What's the confidence level among people that, okay, we'll take it because it's 60 days of peace. But how certain are people that Netanyahu will actually just use that side letter and go right back into war? Yet are considering it anyway. I mean, I think a lot of this also boils down to Donald Trump's relationships with leaders in the Arab world. Jeremy concluded. You know, clearly Qatar, Egypt, and others want this to be brought to an end. They haven't, you know, ever raised the prospect of using military force to end it. But it's quite clear that Trump has deepening relationships with Saudi Arabia. He wants to push forward with his so-called Abraham Accords and get potentially Syria or Lebanon to join on. Saudi Arabia would be the big prize. So, you know, there is some motivation for Trump to try to make this thing stick. But at the end of the day, you know, I spoke to a source close to the negotiations right before I spoke to you guys. And what he's saying is, look, they realize that after 30 or 60 days, the Israelis could resume this genocide. But from their perspective, they still would have cards. They would have 10 living Israeli captives. They would have about a dozen or so bodies of deceased Israelis. They don't feel like they would have depleted everything they have. But they will be giving up half of what they view as the only negotiating assets that they have. I really get the sense that they feel like they need to make a deal right now. So I think we're going to see a last-minute flurry of activity where they try to get some concessions or even get a side letter of their own from the White House. Which I've been told by sources is a possibility. Something saying, look, we can't put this in the real deal. But as long as Qassam brigades and Soraya al-Quds are not firing on the Israelis, meaning that they're not the ones breaking the ceasefire, and as long as you are negotiating in good faith, Trump is committed to making sure aid flow continues beyond 60 days and that the Israelis are not going to resume a full scorched earth bombing campaign. I think Palestinians are in an unspeakable situation right now. The level of desperation is off the charts. The entire society is being slowly strangled to death. And these guys negotiating this deal, as cartoonishly as they're portrayed, they're not immune to it. Some of them. Their mothers have been killed. Their brothers have been killed. Their children have been killed. You know. We think of them in a cartoonish way. But actually, as Adam Baller said after he met with Hamas, you know, they're human beings, too. So, I think what they're trying to do is get the best deal they can get that doesn't surrender the cause of Palestinian liberation. And that's why they fought so hard to get that withdrawal and a commitment that the genocide won't be resumed. And then, against all odds, a breakthrough occurred. After a tense weekend of non-stop talks, mediated by Egypt, Qatar, and a surprisingly persistent White House, the deal was not only accepted but strengthened. The desperation of the Gazan people, echoed through every channel, finally outweighed the political posturing. The 60-day truce began. And for the first time in months, a profound and hopeful silence fell over the Strip. The aid, guaranteed by an international coalition, flowed in not as a trickle, but as a flood. As the weeks passed, the temporary truce began to feel more permanent. The side letters and secret assurances became relics of a conflict that both sides, exhausted and battered, no longer wished to pursue. The initial release of captives went smoothly, and the second release on day 50 was met with a commitment to negotiate the return of all remaining captives and prisoners. The world watched, holding its breath, as bulldozers began clearing rubble, not for military incursions, but for new homes and hospitals. The Philadelphia corridor became a symbol not of military control, but of open passage for reconstruction and renewal. President Trump, seeing a historic legacy within his grasp, leaned heavily on all parties to transform the ceasefire into a lasting political settlement. For the people on the ground, the political intricacies mattered less than the simple, beautiful fact of peace. Children returned to the streets. Markets slowly reopened. And the quiet hum of a society rebuilding itself replaced the sounds of war. It was a fragile dawn. But it was a dawn nonetheless. Born from the depths of despair and the universal human desire to live. Jeremy, thank you for your reporting on this. And thanks for joining us. We'll certainly continue to follow it. Thank you guys. Hey. If you found that analysis insightful, please hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people and supports our work. And if you'd like to get the full show, ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com. That's right. Get the full show and help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com. Thank you for watching.